This is Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. And our guest today is Lauren Oakes. Dr. Lauren Oakes, you wrote a book. You wrote a lot of things. I read a lot of your words. Tree Keepers, The Race for a Forested Future. Oh my gosh. Hi, welcome to Colorado.
Thank you. Pleasure to join you.
I'm so
for
excited.
The Reckoning.
And, oh my gosh. And this book, this is so freaking good.
Oh, you're spreading it. It's great.
So, I am so excited to talk to you about this book. This is amazing. I want to ask you about you. Do you want to introduce yourself as we're coming along here? Because
Sure.
I said your name, but nothing else.
I am a scientist and science writer. By training, I'm an interdisciplinary environmental scientist, but mainly forest ecology and land change science. So, yeah, I've spent a lot of time doing research on our world's forests, how people are managing them, how we can manage them better. But I love storytelling. So this is my second book. My first book was called In Search of the Canary Tree. And this one came out just recently, hot off the press, especially if you're in the UK. And it came out of really an interest in taking a hard look at this tree planting movement. And there's been a lot of interest in tree planting around the world in recent years. It's kind of a catch-all way to do something good for the planet. And boy, if you open your Google and, just Google tree planting efforts, you get a lot of different takes on, are they good or are they bad? What do they do? And what could they do? And anyway, I wanted to take a real critical look at what is the potential of forests to make this world more habitable into the future and also to help combat climate change.
Yeah. So I love how you wrote this book. This book feels deeply personal as I'm reading it, which, I think is, you're talking about your personal experiences, which is a narrative that I loved as far as just, I think it fills the book with so much more meaning than just say, hey, these are trees and we should like them, or we should plant some more of them. And I really enjoyed the journey, Lauren, that you take us on here as you're talking to people and you're thinking through things and you're kind of relating them back and forth about your own family and things. So this is not the forestry book I thought I was getting. When I told Basic, I was like, hey, send me this book. And I opened it up. I was like, oh, this is good. So, I really dug how you wrote the book.
Yeah, I try to kind of blend personal experience, with the solid research and reporting. I always think of Ed Young as a comparison. He's at The Atlantic. I really love his writing and research, and he's an astounding writer. But I can never. So far I haven't succeeded with writing, without myself in the story to some extent. And I felt like I've obviously chosen topics that I'm, an expert on to a degree. And then I do more research and reporting. So I'm kind of wearing two hats. I suppose if I do another book that is not at all forest and climate related, maybe I could pull off the fully reported, no personal aspect in it.
No way. I want more of this. I was like, can I get her to go to the Everglades and write about write about the river of grass down there? Because we've seen a couple of good books out there, but I'm a Floridian. I want to read more stuff from home. But I want to ask you a little bit first before we get into this. What does a forest ecologist do? I want to kind of lay out some groundwork here and talk a little bit about your work prior to these books and talk about how you came into the work that you do, the ideas behind it, and kind of flesh that out a little bit.
Okay. First of all, what does a forest ecologist do? I'd say if you're
6 hours.
Strict disciplinary forest ecologist, you're trained with a Ph.D. in just forest ecology. There's lots of different ways that can be applied today in the world. You may end up a professor doing a lot of research on the health of our forests, interactions and biodiversity within forests. It can include a lot of field work, which I have done. There's also lots of other applications outside academia and forest ecology. Whether you're working, for a city planner, trying to advise on forest cover in cities, working on, for a timber company on how to manage a forest. Now, as we'll probably touch upon further on in our discussion, there's also a lot of corporate interest in forest ecologists now, as more companies are supporting tree planting or tree growing endeavors for carbon. So there's lots of different ways you can apply that career or that knowledge in the world. I have been affiliated with Stanford for a number of years as a researcher, as a teacher. I have done field work in a number of different places, usually relatively remote forests. And I have also worked for the Wildlife Conservation Society, their forests and climate change team, which is, it's a nonprofit organization really looking to help local communities, or that team is helping local communities manage their forests in ways that can help sustain them into the future. And I've also done some consulting, had an opportunity to work for a company called SolGuard last year. They make luggage out of recycled plastic, which sounds so far from forest ecology, but this is super cool. They help develop these waste management systems in countries that have a lot of problems with trash. And they've been doing work in Indonesia with some cleanup efforts and had been noticing that the plastics removals were having what seemed to be a positive impact on mangrove regeneration. So I came in as a consultant to look at how could we, assess this, how are the mangroves in these areas doing better, and, are there benefits from this work for biodiversity as well. That was a super cool project.
Yeah, so I love mangroves with my whole heart. The Floridian in me, they're so crucial to combating climate change, to soil erosion, to saltwater intrusion. Like, people don't know about this tree, and I love it so freaking much. Also, in my own mind, when I see mangroves, I'm associating manatees and all the fish and turtles and things like that I get to see when I'm on my paddleboard back home. And yeah, so I'm here all day for mangrove discussions. I want to ask you. You talked about this book being 4 years into the writing, into the research and writing. Where does this book come from? When you were, where's the germination? Seed, where's the seed, Lauren, this? I'm sorry, I had to.
How did it branch out?
Oh my gosh! All right, now you're going to do it. Okay, good. Let's just go down there. All right, go ahead.
What were the roots? Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll stop.
I brought for you. I thought, how about a chipmunks? Since we're talking about trees today, it's like chipmunks or boreal. Like, I'll do this. So this is my mug.
So,
yeah, right.
Like I said, I love the storytelling, and I kind of keep wearing two hats, doing some research, doing some consulting, then doing some writing. And I had finished writing In Search of the Canary Tree, which is a book that came out of my Ph.D. research. It is a story of a tree that's dying because of climate change, largely in Alaska. And I was looking at how the forest communities respond, how do they change over time, and also how are communities in that area really coping or adapting to the impacts of climate change. But the book is, also a story of being a young scientist who knows a lot about climate change and has struggled with someone who has struggled with my own sense of grief around it and what can I do? And it is a hopeful story. But I think coming out of that, I started thinking about countries that were doing things differently. There's a scientist at Stanford who was one of my advisors when I was getting my PhD, Eric Lambin, who's done a lot of work on forest transitions. So these are countries that have gone from a trend of deforestation to reforest, or they're essentially increasing their forest cover one way or another. These are countries like Bhutan, China, Vietnam, Costa Rica, regions like the United States, the eastern United States many more years ago. And there's also historical transitions in parts of Europe where countries have gone from great loss to gain. Scotland is another example. Anyhow, I started thinking, could this really be a global transition? Could there be a global transition? Sorry, let me redo that. I started thinking, could there be a global forest transition? And at the same time, this was like 2018, 2019. Well, in 2019, a study came out. The senior author on it is a scientist named Tom Crowther. He's based at ETH Zurich. And the lead author is a Belgian. His name is Jean-Francois Bastin. And this study was looking at the global potential of forests. So in the absence of human beings, where could forests grow back, or where could they be? Where could we have more forests? And Tom Crowther had done a study a few years prior looking at how many trees we have in the world, and he basically found that he and his team that we have about 3 trillion trees. At the dawn of civilization, or the dawn of, we had more. Sorry, let me do that again. In comparison, at the dawn of civilization or human civilization, we probably had more, around 6 trillion. So we're down about half. And then the study in 2019, said we could have about 1 trillion more. And they also went ahead and estimated how much carbon those trees could sequester, and, put forward the idea in their research and in the media that tree planting could help sequester a lot more carbon and could be a great contributor to the number of solutions needed. Well, what happened was a lot of, first of all, it gained incredible traction. A lot of studies get published and nobody ever noticed. And this one got like 700, media hits within like weeks of its publication in Rolling Stone and publications that I would never even think of writing about, scientific studies.
Listen, those magazines are printed on paper, right?
Yeah.
So they've got a vested interest in trees.
Yeah, but I think of like Nirvana when I think of Rolling Stone.
Oh, yeah, totally, right?
Not like tree planting and science.
What are you doing here, right?
It went, huge. And there were governments, standing up saying, well, I want to commit to planting more trees. There were oil executives saying, I'm going to invest in more forests. And, all of a sudden it looked like this, kind of silver bullet to climate change, which is not the case. It can help with the many solutions needed, but it's not the silver bullet. At that time, with all the media, and there were headlines like "tree planting's the climate solution," "tree planting won't work." Like it was, one side or the other, and I felt like there were a lot of 800-word articles. And as a scientist, as a putting on my other hat as a reporter, I felt like someone could take a deep dive into this question of, to what extent can trees really help make the planet more habitable, but also how can they help combat climate change? And the project is a blend of research I have done, research others have done, and it really builds off interviews with about 150 people around the world who are involved in this effort to increase tree cover in one way or another.
You keep saying that you're putting on these 2 different hats, but there's this third hat that I found really absolutely stimulating, which is that you and I share in common, which is that we're both parents. And you talk very openly about your relationship to your child, your husband, and like these concerns over like the future and relating these back and forth. And I felt, Lauren, like that was such a key aspect to understanding how you were thinking through all of these kinds of things, because at the end of the day, this felt like a very personal story as well, as you're kind of bringing us through the histories of these forests and the questions around them, if you will. I want to ask you, though, a very simple, easy question. What is a forest to begin with?
It should be an easy question.
It should be an easy question, right? But as I'm reading the book, and you're talking about all these different forests all over the place, and the tremendous amount of cultures and people that you're talking to and things like that, I'm thinking about how do people conceptualize what a forest is. I think you and I both know through our own both works that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge out there, but it doesn't always, it comes from different places, different learning experiences, things like that. So I'm kind of wondering, as our listeners are listening in, what's a forest? Like, what is a forest, and what does a forest do? What's in the Seinfeldian way? What's the big deal about forests?
I mean, you'd want the answer to be quite simple, but what is a forest is actually a complicated question.
Yes.
And there's a chapter in the book that really takes a deep dive into this topic, because I felt like if you're going to look around the world and say, what are we losing and what are we gaining? We need to be able to compare them, to some extent.
Right.
Like forests are still being cleared, and yes, forests are being planted, and some of them are still growing. But are they all the same? Are they all the same kind of forest? No. Right. There's such a diversity of the types of forest. Believe it or not, there's about 800 definitions of forests in the academic literature. That's if you just get kind of nerdy alone. But I'm sure if you went to many different cultures and communities, people have lots of different answers for what a forest is. And I think, well, one of the most moving definitions I've heard is just that a forest is a feeling, that you get a feeling inside a forest that is not like any others, not like any other feeling, at least that I have known. And that really doesn't have any scientific veracity, does it? But a forest is a feeling.
Actually, I would say that in some ways very much so, right? Because when I've been out in my work with tribes out here with the Forest Service, which is absolutely not sponsoring this pod, but I've had elders tell me when I've been out in the woods looking at different areas and things like that in Colorado, they're like, "Look, don't see this place, feel it."
Yeah,
I mean, quite literally. I mean, it's that you say that it's a feeling is so true to my own experience with the folks out here that I work with who have ties to these landscapes here in Colorado and Kansas, because that's exactly what they say.
Mm-hmm.
I
love that. Yeah. And if you think, there's a reason why there's so many different definitions. If you think of just in the literature alone, definitions coming from different countries or regions, a forest like a mangrove forest, which may be a strip along the ocean versus like a dense, intact forest in the Amazon or Borneo, compared to a boreal forest or even an urban forest. They all have, just a very different community of species dependent on them. They have different, features and different species present, and some of them have more dense tree canopy cover than others. But when you try to answer the question, which I was, of just like how are forests doing around the world, it means you got to take a lot of complicated variables and put them into one, which is you need one kind of universal definition of what a tree is, or of what a forest is. So there are efforts around there. Sorry, let me start again. There are efforts to compile data from countries around the world, from surveys they do, to get kind of a state of the world's forests. But a lot of that monitoring today is done via satellite. And so if you're working off many different definitions from various parts of the world and trying to put it together in all, across the world to say where is forest and where isn't, where is forest absent, it doesn't work. So that's just to say most scientific studies that are looking at a global estimate, use one definition or share one definition they choose, but that may not capture everything that a forest is. And I thought for me, like I spent a lot of time in relatively intact forests. And for me, spending time in the urban environment was really eye-opening because I loved how, people in cities will sometimes define the urban forest as the whole urban area. It's not like a green space inside a dense city. Like it is an urban forest, which includes trees, integrated with cities. Then that's a really different perspective than a forest is, a stand of that are managed together under a single ownership or a single, land designation.
So much of the book, we're talking about climate change. It's a real thing that I think everybody is dealing with, whether they want to or not right now. As we look at, I talked to my folks back in Kentucky growing up, right? And they're like, man, they don't believe in climate change. And then I talked to folks who are like, well, it doesn't snow here like it used to. I was like, okay. We're getting there. We're getting close. No, we die. Can we talk about the role of forests in combating climate change and their importance in the ecosystem itself? Because we talk early on in the book about the importance of like, hey, we can have more trees. We can put more out there. Why? Like, what do trees do? What do these forests do when it comes to fighting climate change or helping to preserve the environment as we have it today?
Yeah, great question. So we talked about the definition of forest, but I didn't get to tree. And there's not actually one universal definition of a tree.
Good point.
But I will say that this gets to the carbon. I'm going to get to the carbon.
Okay.
Is that the main distinguishing thing between a tree and other plants is its bole, its woody bole, that trunk. So, if you look at a shrub, there's a threshold between a shrub that doesn't really have a big, thick bole, like a singular stem, and this tree that's got a lot of wood. And that wood is special in this case because it sequesters a lot of carbon, and particularly for species that are, really dense wood, you get better rates of carbon sequestration. So, that is to say that these trees, around the world have been sequestering carbon for as long as trees have been, and I go back in deep time even to the Carboniferous period and look at the carbon that they sequestered and then stored underground and preserved, which later became oil, to great irony. But our trees around the world today, so just to give you a little context, in recent years, our global carbon emissions have been about 37.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide. That's from everybody. That's from all countries contributing in the world, or some much more than others. But then the forests that exist today are sequestering about a third of those emissions. So those are trees that are still standing, already doing an enormous service to suck carbon out of the atmosphere that we are emitting on an annual basis. And that's, in essence, a great argument for why we need to keep them, why we need to first keep the trees that we have standing, because they're already doing some great work for climate change and mitigating some of the emissions that we put forward. We could probably increase that to about a half. Those are kind of rough numbers, but we have more potential for forests to sequester, more carbon into the future with these planting efforts. And, when I say half, that's assuming our emissions stay relatively constant. But in the dream scenario, or in the most hopeful scenario we should be tackling, we're reducing emissions while we're also doing this kind of work. And this work is accompanied by many other solutions because trees won't get us there completely. And I should also point out that, that we're talking about carbon. So, there are many other greenhouse gases that are contributing to the climate crisis, methane being a major contributor. So even if trees were the perfect solution for carbon, we still have other gases that are causing a problem.
All right, I have to ask you about the methane thing because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the introduction of cattle.
Oh my gosh! Okay, well you should go there. Florida. You're more of an expert than I am.
Oh no, I wasn't concerned with methane emissions as much as like polity formation and also making fun of like early Florida towns. These poor white towns near Gainesville because I went to Florida State, so I was going to take shots at the University of Florida. But when you talk about methane emissions, the first thing that pops in my mind are like these massive cattle ranches that are cattle baronies that are taking place down the Amazon, here in North America, places like that. Is that what when we talk about methane emissions? Is it ranching that specifically, or is it just?
You definitely have some from cattle and then other sources from industry. And then even now in northern latitudes, as you have permafrost leaks and permafrost melt, you're getting leaks from the earth itself where methane is stored, these kind of high altitude lakes. But you're definitely going to the edges of my knowledge. I'm more of a carbon girl.
Oh. Well, good. You'll be carbon girl. I'll be methane man.
Okay,
and then together we'll fight ecological crime. Now I think we're on the FBI's database. So
natural sources, human activities, agriculture being a huge one of them.
Right.
I think waste management is another one. So how like the organic waste in landfills and wastewater treatment.
Right.
And then like these types of treatment facilities that are built in urban centers. I know there's a scientist colleague of mine, Rob Jackson at Stanford, who's done a lot of work on methane. And, some of those projects have just been like traveling around cities measuring methane leaks in areas where the storage mechanisms haven't really held up. But I do know that methane has caused about a third of the warming since the Industrial Revolution, with carbon being about half of the problem. So, there's more than just carbon to tackle with trees.
you talked, Lauren, to what felt like as many people as there are trees. And like you said, 150 people, but I thought it was actually closer to 3 trillion people that you spoke to in this book. And I thought it was really cool because you are going all around the world. I mean, I felt a bit like Indiana Jones with the map kind of going around and things like that. Can we talk about a little bit about your experiences talking to people, conducting these oral histories and these interviews with people, and maybe the cultural, like, because you and I are both Americans. We're here in the quote unquote West or whatever. Like, are you seeing different cultural understandings here of how trees operate or how forests operate, or solutions from different cultures, and things like that? Like I don't want to root everything in like this very American understanding of the world, because there's so much more people out there.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about how the interviews came about, and
please,
also my view. I think we all have, as much as anyone could try to research a topic without, their view shaping it. Inherently, it does to some extent, you know. And I say very early on in the book, like I've worked for an NGO that's, had projects on all plant-covered continents, doing similar type work. I'm a white woman. I come from the United States. Like, as much as I can dig and try to get a non-biased perspective on this topic, like there's still a viewpoint, a view that comes with my lens. So I can't cover it all, and I didn't try completely, but I did instead. Came up, I'd say largely through the first 30 or 40 interviews, a range of topics I wanted to cover. Anything from carbon credits to planting trees outside of their current habitat, planning for the future in terms of climate change, to seed sourcing, projects that are delivering on biodiversity and benefits to local livelihoods in addition to climate change. There's a variety there. Anyhow, so I had these topics, and then started thinking about how do I get into them through story? And I certainly didn't want to do all these interviews and then have it just be popping from one person to the next. And I also have read a fair number of, nonfiction books that take a geographic approach, where it'll be okay, here's my chapter on, forestry in Brazil, or what the state of the world's forests are and what the state of the forests are in Brazil. And then you're kind of popping around these geographies. So instead, I try to take the reader on a journey through really 3 parts. And the first part of the book is looking at what's the state of the world's forests and how do we know that, and how are they going through forest transitions, and what are forest transitions? The second part is about, innovative things that people are doing in restoration and reforestation. And the third is about scale. How could we take these local efforts and scale them to make an impact at the global scale? I felt really lucky coming out of the pandemic. Well, I don't know if that's the right phrasing, but
we survived.
Coming out of the pandemic, I felt like people were more willing to meet on a virtual platform than ever in history. So I don't know that I could have written this book at any other time, because I could contact people who, were willing to meet in that way. And though I interviewed 150 people, I did not travel to meet them all. I don't even want to live with the carbon footprint of that. So I very carefully chose the places that I was going to visit when I knew they were going to be in the book and I needed more description, or I needed to meet more people on the ground. But I really feel grateful for the people that, just wanted to hop on for an hour or 2-hour interview on a virtual platform and share a lot with me. And their perspectives really helped shape the story. So you do meet characters, individual people that I spend a fair bit of time with in each chapter, but I weave these other perspectives into the narrative in what I hope is, a compelling way that gives you a sense of there's a lot of, perspectives informing this story, but I'm still tracking one project at a time, or, one problem at a time, which is seed sourcing or seed storage, or what kind of forest are we creating?
No, the weaving is really the word I was thinking in my head. So when you said it, it's like, yeah, because these stories are kind of interwoven in there. There's not just the whole, okay, we shall now travel to Africa for the next 64 pages, or anything like that. It felt in a lot of ways, Lauren, organic to just the way I was reading. I was like, oh, okay, I get this. But you brought something up just a second ago, which is talking about the status of the world's forests. So maybe that's the big question here for people who are listening in. Should we be terrified? What's going on with our forests worldwide? Like, are we in good shape? Are we in bad shape? Like, where are we?
I mean, this gets to your earlier question of what a forest is, because you can look at places where we are losing forests, and the story continues to show one of degradation, and a scientist and colleague I interviewed, Rachel Garrett, said, I don't really think you could talk about a global forest transition until you've stopped losing those, relatively intact forests, because we can't recreate them. Maybe on a very, very long time scale with very minimal human intervention, they may eventually grow back to close to what they were. But, what we're planting and creating in general, even in the best intentions, is not a pure substitute or swap for anything we're clearing. So the studies, and there are many of them out there that look at, the state of the world's forests. There is a story of loss amidst one of regrowth. And, in northern latitudes and boreal regions, we're gaining more forests, and projects throughout the world, are popping up with planting efforts. But we continue to lose forest that's still primary or relatively intact, that has enormous value. So I guess I just say you have to hold space for both, right? It's like a story of loss and a story of growth.
Sure.
And we need to keep up the efforts to keep the trees that are still standing while thinking about and working on where can we create more in the future.
In your mind's eye, are there particular forests when you say, hey, there are still forests here that are threatened or that we are losing? Are there ones that particularly come to mind in your own mind's eye?
I mean, they're the ones that get a lot of attention in the media, particularly the Amazon,
Sure.
Indonesia, parts of the Congo. Then there are these, countries I write about, like Suriname, for example, what they're called HFLD, so high forest, low deforestation. There are a number of these countries. Suriname is the one that I have visited, not doing research on this book, but many years ago. And those are forests. Those are regions that have, incredibly biodiverse, relatively intact, old growth forests that don't have the same degree of pressure yet. That, and I say yet, you probably caught that. They don't have the same degree of pressure or deforestation rates that we see in some of these other agricultural hotspots where land is converted from forests to cattle use or plantations of other kinds.
Is it just development, Lauren, that's threatening these spaces? Is it climate change? What's the main threat to these magical spaces?
Sure. I mean, the main threat there are a number of threats, but the main obviously is deforestation. There are others like insect infestation, wildfires, drought. Climate change can have an impact on a forest's health or what species survive or whether it transitions from a forest to another type of ecosystem. And in some areas, obviously, these threats outweigh others. Like in the American West, we have a lot of risk of fire. But if you're talking about the Amazon, you're worried about fire and deforestation. And there are a mix of threats that are continuing to degrade forests, but I would say deforestation is the primary.
You mentioned bugs, and insects. And one of the things that drove me from Florida, frankly, when I took this job out here in Colorado, was the fact that in Florida we have this beautiful, beautiful area called the Florida Scrub, which is the peninsular interior. If people are listening and aren't familiar with very sandy soil with these beautiful pine trees and scrub and stuff like these brush and stuff like that. And for me, when I think about Florida right now, Lauren, it is I see these big bulldozers and caterpillars moving in like locusts, and completely the state itself, is completely at risk from overdevelopment.
Yeah.
Because I think the story people well known that the exterior, the rim, the seaboard regions of Florida are well developed, as is like Orlando and other places. But the interior was fairly well open, and it just feels to me like when I look at there, I see it, and it frankly it breaks my heart because the space that I love is just getting overdeveloped.
That's why it's so hard to come up with these like general global answers too, because someone in one community is saying, well, deforestation isn't the problem there. Like here we've got this weird bug, or we've got this insect, or, it's a an area that's really threatened by fires. And generally speaking, these forests that are intact, relatively pristine, are more resilient to these risk factors, outside deforestation, like to insects, to fire, because it's not a monoculture. It's not a secondary forest that has, all of one species that may become threatened by a particular bug or pathogen. Anyhow, so this is kind of one of the reasons why, when possible, moving to reforest in a way that's restoring ecosystem complexity and restoring a diversity of species can create more resilient forests and potentially, enable that forest to survive longer term, given the number of threats that are out there.
You bring up this really interesting dialogue in the book about how do we live with concrete. And I was like, can we talk a little bit about this concrete equation here that you read about in the book? Like, how do we what's going on here with the idea of coming to live with? Because I thought about this much more in my terms of Florida, all the way down to Fort Lauderdale, where there's no green space left in some of these towns. We talk about you talk a lot about urban forests in the book, and I'm like, where? I mean, there's isolated trees here, but how do we come to terms with these cities and concrete? How does all this stuff factor in?
Well, I think when people are investing in reforestation projects, or when companies or governments are, particularly trying to think about, what are the biggest wins we can get for climate? Like they're looking for large tracts of areas, or many landowners that can come together to reforest, a big landscape. That's really different than thinking about reforesting or growing more trees in an urban setting. But more people, come in contact with trees in an urban setting than in some of these relatively remote areas. And I think the urban setting is the perfect one to highlight the diversity of benefits that come from trees that are not just carbon. They have a tremendous shade and cooling effect. Some studies in Portland, for example, have shown an area with, they call it a well-canopied neighborhood, maybe 20 degrees cooler in the summertime than a community close by, without a lot of trees. That has effects on elderly health, has economic implications for people if they're turning on their fans or air conditioning. There are studies showing correlations between test scores and tree canopy. So kids in schools may be testing higher with more exposure to nature or trees. There's definitely a movement to green and increased tree cover around schools in California, as well as a nationwide one. So I kind of love the urban context because it becomes so clear that trees are about so much more than just the carbon. But, I should also point out, to your answer of what do we do or how do we, I think a community needs, whether it's in an urban area or a remote, far off forest, a community of people needs to support the idea that this land, whatever it currently is, becomes a forest again. So, in the urban setting, I talk to people who are involved in kind of depavement movements. So these are a lot of times, like in an urban area, you'll get an area paved, and it may not even be used for anything yet, but it could in the future. And so you kind of plan for that, but those could be green areas right now. And there's a movement to remove some of that. Or if you think on a smaller scale, planning a city street, like where could those trees go along a city street? And to go back to our comment that a forest is a feeling, I think about the times I've walked down, narrow streets in Providence, Rhode Island in the fall where you're like kicking about leaves and you smell the trees or...
sounds heavenly right now.
Right. Or like Seattle, which has a, a really good tree cover rate for an urban city that's as dense as it is. And you walk down streets and you're picking up big leaf maple. So, those are cities that have worked to integrate trees into the urban equation, and not just in a green space, but throughout. But as you point to Florida, I will say I've been there a few times as well, and I'm like driving down the road being like, where are the trees?
Yeah.
Where are the trees? I don't know the percentage. I don't know the average percentage in cities in Florida, but I would imagine it's quite low.
I have a love for that peninsula. I may be the last person standing that will defend Florida till the day I die. And maybe that's because I'm not from there originally. I'm from Kentucky. And then I went to Florida. I was like, what is this? That to me is home. Along with Louisiana, but that's another story. What about tree equity, Lauren? This was a concept I had never heard of. I wasn't familiar with this, and this really interesting idea you put forth about the idea of trees and forests as part of human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is this? Can we talk a little bit?
Essentially, it's the equal access to the many different benefits that trees provide, and that becomes even more apparent in this urban context. So if you talk about a kiddo growing up in an area with literally like 7% trees or 7% tree cover or no trees at all in their area, and they don't get the benefits of the shade. They don't get the benefits of the feeling of being around a tree. They might not get the benefits that we're still understanding about how trees, affect our levels of anxiety or can calm the mind or maybe even improve test scores. That's an equity issue. And, it turns out that the inequitable distribution of tree cover is also overlaid with a lot of other inequities. So, wealthier communities tend to be able to, pay for and support the upkeep of trees, whereas a community that is more strained doesn't have that bandwidth. Under the Biden administration, there was, a large push and a great amount of funding, $1.5 billion, that went towards this issue of tree equity. And that was a multi-year project, so we'll see how that unfolds under the new administration. And I'm very hopeful that program could continue. But I love I feel like framing it in this concept of tree equity really makes it clear how essential trees are to life, and that, well, one urban planner put it in this way, which is like, you think of street lamps. Street lamps are a part of every urban landscape, and they receive funding to help maintain the lamp, or the light, or if it breaks, someone's going to go out and fix it. Shouldn't trees be the same way? Like, I love that.
When you talk about this, and I'm thinking about the experiences I have when I'm walking around, like any park. I'm here in Colorado. There's beautiful trees everywhere where I'm at in Pueblo, and one of my favorite things in the world is like watching squirrels. Right, and people, I think I'm team squirrel here because they get in bird feeders and eat all stuff. I just love them. But I kept thinking as you're talking about this, Lauren, about the kids who are growing up who don't have those little engagements of, hey, little fella, or whatever, because all of the things that these trees provide, whether it's like go climb on a branch. Or if you're 4 years old and you're Jason Herbert and you fall from said tree and break your leg, you don't get a really cool story out of that you get to tell later on. No squirrels were there to help you that day.
I interviewed a couple. I was going to say I interviewed a couple of pediatricians who are working on nature contact or nature exposure. It's called in the medical world, and there's actually a a new book out for the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'm not going to say it right, but it's whoever oversees pediatrics.
Whoever.
And
Other doctors.
let's look it up. So
Weird doctors. We have PhDs.
Let me frame that.
Go on.
American Pediatrics Association. American Academy of Pediatrics. Okay, let's redo that. There's a new book out published through the American Academy of Pediatrics looking at this topic of nature contact and trying to get more doctors to put that into your child wellness plan. That, when you come there and you're learning about like all the things you should be doing for your kiddo this year, one of those things is also making sure they're in some green space or get some time with trees. And, there's real data behind that as to why, doctors are advocating for this because, it helps a child's ability to focus. It has a calming effect. There is, even some studies showing benefits in social interactions with family members when you're spending time in nature. So I love the idea that it should be a part of our well child visit, but it also brings up the question again of, well, then does the child have access? If you're trying to get doctors to say your child should spend some time in nature, well, that kiddo needs a park nearby, wherever you are.
Yeah. And then you get into like real class dynamics, racial dynamics of all these things. We talk about, urban cities, redlining, stuff like that. I can tell you that in my own work here inside the Forest Service, one of the things we've grappled with is the idea is like, look, the vast majority of people who are getting out into the woods look like me, right? Because our big national forests, which are big, beautiful, and majestic, tend to be removed from the cities. And, how do we make how do we have a more diverse nature to nature, right? And I totally feel you on this idea that I've read a lot of friends of mine who have horses, who lend their horses, who do like horse therapy with other kids and things like that. I know this is like a thing now. I have to tell you, Lauren, like when I don't get out in the woods or I don't go fishing or I don't spend time outdoors, I get the worst anxiety. And I don't know if this is a thing that happens with you or not, but I absolutely buy into this idea that like, you've got to get outside.
I think, you're pointing to one of the lessons, I learned from the many people that I interviewed that this act of restoration is, about our forests, but it is about ourselves too. And the restorative work, is one of repair between a relationship of, individuals and species, but also really has a lot of benefits on our physical experience and our psychological experience. There are some programs in schools now in the U.S. that are building, tree restoration or tree planting or caring for trees, like, same kind of farm to table garden programs, because of the benefits. And this is kind of also what you're touching upon, one of the reasons why I brought my relationship with my son into this book, because I feel like I kind of use his lens to explain this concept of ecological baseline, which is a little bit hard to understand, but it's the idea that like at one, here's your starting point. And if we're working to restore a forest, are we looking at what it was in 2000? Or are we looking at it was in 1900? Like, what are we going back to? And also, how does our baseline perspective change over time? And, one of the things I love about taking my son out and just adventuring with him is getting to feel that level of, or that experience of wonder and awe in a lot of different settings. Whereas, my very like heady scientific way would be standing in a secondary forest. I would be standing in a secondary forest thinking like, okay, what was this before? And what have we lost? What have we gained?
You're lost analyzing stuff.
Right. And for him, he's in that wonder, of, well, here we are in a forest and this is like a pretty incredible forest, even if I don't know, it was something different before.
Yeah. I wonder so much of this, as I'm reading through the book, Lauren, is, we're talking about restoring forests and restoring maybe an order of things. But as you and I are talking, I keep thinking now about the idea of restoring by the relationships that humans have with the world in which we occupy, that we live and engage, right? And much as it's like is, the idea is like, a body should be at movement, right? You're best when your body is moving around, but I'm also like, your body should be engaged with the outdoors. And when there's no outdoors to engage with, maybe there's the idea that we suffer on some level from all of this.
I think that's definitely true. And that's part of the reason that I am very excited or inspired by the work that people are doing to increase green spaces or tree cover in urban areas, because it's just touching so many human lives. But that's really different than the very important work that is underway in areas working to restore biodiversity and a greater number of species. I spent some time in Panama. This was actually a chapter that's all in Panama, so I do have a few of those. But this is towards the end of the book, and towards the end of my research, I was looking for projects that were bringing together many different landowners and many people who wanted to see their land use change. I was looking for a project that was restoring biodiversity in a really biodiverse place that would also deliver carbon benefits, that a company was investing in at the time Microsoft was considering, and they did invest later. And this project really hit the mark for all of these categories and more. But that's a really different kind of effort than trying to increase tree cover in an urban city or around a school or a city or a city street. Important for many other reasons, and equally important, just different reasons.
Well, we are entering, by the time this pod comes out, we're going to be entering into a new presidential administration. There is seems like we've got big businesses doing so much, calling so many shots right now. And I'm wondering, you wrote about this thing. I had never heard of this before. This idea of forest carbon credits, and I'm wondering, because there's
Were
a lot
carbon
of
credits
good.
totally new to you? I'd love to.
Oh, absolutely!
Wow. Okay. Cool.
I completely introduced. So I was like, "What is this?" This whole storyline, I was completely unfamiliar with. I was like, "What?" I have to ask her about this. So, can we talk actually about this idea of forest carbon credits and how we can restore forests through this? What's going on with this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So, one big question. There are many. Probably listeners have lots they want to raise. But one is where does the money come from?
They should read the book.
Right, yeah, read the book.
Yes, buy the book.
It's always the
yes.
But where does the money come from this work?
Totally.
And restorative activities or tree planting is really, growing trees is not just about the planting action, but once you get the tree in the ground, well, first of all, what did it take to get to the tree? So where did the seedling come from? Where was the seed collected? Who grew it out? Right. What did we plant? Then how do you, water it if it needs water for the next year to 2 years and keep it into the future? There needs to be an economic incentive to keep that tree. And there's plenty of economic drivers to clear our land and use it for other purposes, agriculture, urban development. We've touched upon them all. Forest carbon credits are a really fascinating financial mechanism that comes out of the idea of an offset. Now we're getting into a lot of terms, but I'm going to try to break them down.
Go for it.
An offset, is essentially a company or a country emits emissions via one source. And then they want to offset, say, okay, even though I'm putting this into the atmosphere, in another part of the planet, I'm going to do something else to suck up emissions. Right. And it was this idea, that I was fascinated. I kind of went back to what were the earliest projects, and there's a chapter about one of the earliest offsets, which happened when I was 8 years old, and not that long after James Hansen sat before the U.S. Senate and said global warming was a problem. So people acted upon this quickly in that sense of thinking okay, well, we could offset, and we might even be able to offset with trees. So AES was a company that supported a tree planting project in Guatemala as a means to offset emissions from energy. And it was an early effort. So it's not as wasn't as formal as the systems that we have are today. But today, there's a voluntary carbon market. Again, lots of big words here. But you can essentially, if you're a company, you can go and try to buy up a credit. And that means that in some place, someone is, or, a number of people are implementing a project that's going to sequester carbon. And we try to put an estimate on that. And the estimates aren't perfect. But it ends up being essentially like a permission to emit in one place for what you're correcting for elsewhere.
Gotcha.
The problem, is that they're not perfect swaps. There's all kinds of reasons to that I could probably take a lot more time to go into. They're not perfect swaps. But this, concept in the market, has attracted companies that are seeking net zero to kind of to support this type of work as, part of a portfolio of actions where, you may be reducing emissions inside your own supply chain, but also looking at where can you offset or where can you invest to help develop more credits that could be used. And that essentially means a project is certified. Like you have to go out and measure the trees and track them and make sure they stay for many years to come and sequester the carbon that we think they should. And the benefits, that there's been a lot of critiques of these types of projects and there's also benefits. The project I visited in Panama, for example, well, first of all, you're getting funding from a company like a source like Microsoft that probably wouldn't think of investing in forests in, Panama otherwise, unless it was just like a pure donation. So you're supporting the costs involved in doing the restorative work. But in the best case scenarios, that money can go to the landowners. So in that case, landowners there had been relying upon cattle production, and given drought and the hot, like a longer dry season there, the productivity of the land has really gone down, and raising cattle is just not a economically viable source or as productive as it once was. So converting, the landowners that I met with really wanted another way to use their land and to gain from it. So the work they do to reforest will help bring income over time from the carbon that those trees sequester from keeping them. And it also does some other, interesting work, in that project, for example, if they're going to plant 1 million trees or more, where's that seed coming from? So there was a great program in place to kind of provide another job opportunity for many women and families in the community. There were a lot of seed like nurseries in people's backyards. So a mother who is home with her 2 children could be watering these seedlings and then selling them back to the nursery later once they grew big to help support the larger effort. So that's just another example of how a project could have trickle-down effects of not just benefiting the landowner, but also bringing in some more opportunities that weren't there.
Lauren, I don't want to spoil the whole book because I think it's a fascinating read. And I'm hoping people will read this because I think it's just beautiful. And when I saw Basic put it out, I was like, I have to read this thing. I'm so glad I did. And I know as we're going to come to a close here, I'm kind of wondering, the big question here is, can we save the world through forests? Or like, can we pull this off? What are your thoughts here?
I think I walk away with saying that, let me reframe. I walk away with believing that the work we're doing will be really important for many, many years to come, and that it's not perfect, and we can make it better. And there are some things I suggest, we can do to help make that work better. But, forests have always been, the lungs of our planet, essential to life. So even if there are challenges we're facing, and people often raise the question of, well, we're gonna do all this work and then the forests are just gonna burn. To me, those are all raise alarm bells or heighten the call to action to do this work with our best intentions and to choose strategically where we do this work and to invest in high quality projects and we need to fight for forests. I'm hopeful about that. And I think part of what came, in the title of Tree Keepers, and we've touched upon it here, but, so many people that I got to meet and are coming from a diversity of walks of life and so many parts of the planet that there is a movement underway. And I'd like to see it grow. And I think it will.
I couldn't agree more. I am so excited. I felt a real connection with you when I was reading as far as just like the idea of the importance of these spaces, what they mean, not only on a biological scale, but on a real human level as well. The ability to relate to the world that we live in through these spaces.
And I guess part of like one of the messages I want to leave, more readers, and you happen to be one that comes from the forest world, but hopefully
I'm a woodsman, yes.
Hopefully we get, all walks of life picking up tree keepers, is that I do honestly believe we can all be a tree keeper to some extent, and it is in us, it's kind of innate. So how can we fuel that? How can we kindle that and continue to be tree keepers into the future?
I love it. Lauren, thank you so very much for being here today. I had a blast reading the book. Loved the book. Loved talking to you today. Thank you so much for being here. This was amazing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. All right, take care.
All right. Thank you so much. Lauren, this is Lauren Oakes. She wrote this amazing book, Tree Keepers, The Race for a Forested Future. I'm holding it up right now. You can't see this as you're listening.
See it.
It's quite lovely. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody, we got more podcasts coming for you. Stick around.